This special meeting of the University of Michigan Faculty Senate constitutes the 21st annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. I'm Kate Berald. I'm the chair of SACUA and the Faculty Senate. It's a great privilege for me to introduce the president of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, Professor Emerita Peggy Hollingsworth. Peggy was chair of the Faculty Senate and of SACUA, the second woman to serve in this position during the 1990-1991 academic year when this lectureship was founded. So this is the maturity year. This is the 21st anniversary of this lectureship. Peggy's career has been notable not only for her fine scholarly activities, her research, but for her enormous contributions to faculty governance and service here at the University of Michigan, at the state, and at the national level. She received a very large number of well-deserved awards at the university, state, and national levels, and she served in many leadership positions at the university, at her alma mater, Bowling Green State University, which she's headed to tomorrow, and at the state and national levels, including president of Sigma Psi, which, as many of you know, is the Scientific Honor Society, which at the time that Peggy served had about 80,000 members. So Peggy has been a founding member of the Coalition for the Advancement of Blacks in the Biomedical Sciences, and for 5 years, she served as a member of the Minority Programs Review Committee of the National Institute of General Medicine at the NIH. She's worked unceasingly to further academic and scientific careers of women, and especially women in science and engineering, and she's a recipient of the Sarah Goddard Power Award. In 1990, the Senate Assembly began the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund to support this annual lecture series and related events. Peggy has been the president of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund since 1991, since its inception. And she has worked with a group of distinguished and active and retired faculty members, both nationally and internationally, to raise the funds for the continuance of this lecture series. The president of the fund serves with the chair of the Faculty Senate and the president of the Ann Arbor chapter of the AAUP on a committee that selects each year's lecturer. Peggy?
Thank you, Kate. It has been a privilege and indeed a pleasure for the past 20 years to make a few comments at the annual lecture. Louis Franklin Powell Jr. in August 1971, prior to accepting appointment by President Richard M. Nixon to become an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, sent a confidential memorandum to a friend at the United States Chamber of Commerce. The title of the memorandum was, quote, "Attack on the American Free Enterprise System," end quote. It called for corporate America to become more aggressive in molding politics and law in the U.S. and described a strategy for the corporate takeover of the dominant public institutions of American society, including our colleges and universities. In his memorandum, Powell advocated, quote, "constant surveillance, end quote, of textbook and television content, as well as a purge of left-wing elements. Indeed, this document might have sparked the formation of one or more influential right-wing think tanks, such as Michigan's Mackinac Center for Public Policy. In the ensuing years, major changes have taken place in the leadership and governance of our public institutions of higher education. This corporatization of our colleges and universities was a subject discussed by Berkeley historian David Hollinger when he delivered the 9th Annual University of Michigan Senate's lecture on academic and intellectual freedom in 1999, entitled Universities and Cosmopolitanism. Today's lecturer, Ellen Schrecker, returned to this topic the following year, 2000, when she participated in a panel discussion entitled Silencing Voices, as part of the 10th Annual Symposium held to mark the first decade of the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. In the next 10 years, corporatization of our institutions of higher education grew by leaps and bounds. Today, it constitutes one of our greatest challenges and most significant threats to academic and intellectual freedom on our campuses. You who are here today are certainly aware that at the University of Michigan, top administrators and regents are members of the boards of directors of major corporations. Today, we desperately need Americans of all ages who will join the battle to preserve the academic and intellectual freedom guaranteed by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Needed are citizens with the enormous courage that was demonstrated by Professor H. Chandler Davis, when in November 1953 he stood before a subcommittee of the House Un-American Activities Committee and claimed his First Amendment rights. Professor Davis is one of 3 former faculty members after whom this lecture series is named. He is here with us today, as he has been here nearly every year since the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture was first established. Chandler, will you please stand so that we can recognize you? I would be remiss were I not to thank those who not only have made these lectures possible, but who also have made them so successful. The University of Michigan Faculty Senate Assembly adopted the resolution that established the series. The American Association of University Professors, AAUP, provided a grant to support the first lecture with the proviso that our faculty matched the grant. And the directors and members of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund over the years have ardently supported the cause of academic and intellectual freedom and have given whatever they could afford to sustain and promote the series. In addition, again this year, a contribution for the lecture series was included in the philanthropy of an anonymous donor. Some academic and administrative units at the University of Michigan today provide support both in money and in space for the lecture series, as well as the organizations and groups listed in your program. The advisory board of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund and the past Davis Markert Nickerson lectures have had a key role in the recruitment of distinguished scholars who deliver the annual lecture. We have the good fortune to have with us today from Michigan Productions, the senior producer, Scott Mann, and his associates, Carl Cohn and Ed Hamlin, who each year record the lectures so that they can be seen by those who cannot be with us today. Finally, the staff of the Faculty Senate Office, Thomas Schneider, and especially Linda Carr, as well as Emily Arntz, and the students who work in the Faculty Senate Office provide the necessary staff and logistical support. This year, the students who assisted us were Danielle Nyquist, who is a master's candidate in School of Social Work, and Brandon Shaw, an LS&A undergraduate in political communications with an emphasis in integrated marketing. And now, history professor and dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, Terrence J. McDonald, will introduce this year's University of Michigan Senate's Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. Professor McDonald, thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today for 2 reasons. First, because This is a commemoration of a moment of American history here at the university, and one from which we have to commit ourselves to learn, and secondly, to be able to introduce one of the most distinguished American historians of this period living today, our guest speaker, Ellen Schrecker. The time at Michigan this lecture contains important lessons about institutional fear and failure and individual courage that deserve our reflection. In 1953, during the height of the anti-communist hysteria that would later be called the McCarthy period, Professors H. Chandler Davis, Mark Nickerson, and Clement Markert were served with subpoenas by the House Un-American Activities Committee, the committee that had developed for itself the mission to investigate the alleged communist threat to a variety of American institutions. All three faculty refused to cooperate with the committee on the grounds of their First and Fifth Amendment constitutional rights. All three were suspended by the university and subjected to disciplinary hearings conducted by our Senate Assembly. At the end of this, 2 of them were dismissed from the university. What should not be lost sight of today, however, is that this was not only a chapter in the history of a notorious congressional committee or a sad moment in the history of the United States, but an instance in which our own faculty failed to protect the rights of colleagues. We often read that the university dismissed these 3 faculty members or disciplined these 3 faculty members, but in fact, those penalties were recommended by our own faculty committees. It was not until 1990 that at the urging of the local chapter of the American Association of University Professors that the Senate Assembly passed a resolution that deeply regretted the failure of the university community to protect the fundamental values of intellectual freedom in 1954. And it was that resolution that established this memorial lecture every year, in which we're now going to enjoy the 21st instance of. So it's important as we honor today the courage and sacrifice of these brave individuals from the 1950s that we promise to repay both of those things by our own constant protection of the constitutional rights of our faculty, so that never again will there be an instance when we vote against the rights of our own faculty colleagues. There's no one in this country better able to remind us of this fact than Ellen Schrecker, who has spent her life studying the baleful effect of this period on universities and is certainly one of the leading experts of this period in the United States. Ellen Schrecker is a professor of history at Yeshiva University. She received her bachelor's at Radcliffe and her master's and PhD at Harvard. She taught at Harvard, Princeton, NYU, Columbia, and the New School for Social Research. From 1998 to 2002, she was the editor of Academe, the journal of the American Association of University Professors. Professor Schrecker has written several books on the Cold War and Red Scare that have defined the relationship between that period and that political movement in universities in America. No Ivory Tower, McCarthyism and the Universities was published in 1986. The Age of McCarthyism, A Brief History with Documents was published in 1994 and reissued in 2002. And Many Are the Crimes, McCarthyism in America was published in 1998. Of the last book, Kirkus Reviews wrote, "This is a marvelous and chilling work. It reminds us how easily democratic processes can be jettisoned in the name of national security." Other publications, including those on academic freedom, have included the books Regulating the Intellectuals, Perspectives on Academic Freedom in the 1980s, and Historical Revisionism, such as Cold War Triumphalism, Exploring the Misuse of History After the Fall of Communism, which was published in 2004. Most of her other published articles and essays have dealt with the same 2 subjects, the fundamentally important questions, exploring the different aspects of the academic scene and Cold War political repression. Her work has been recognized by fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Bunting Institute at Radcliffe, and the National Humanities Center. She has served as chair of her department for 5 years and a member of the National Council of the AAUP from 2005 to 2011. She's been a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, and her books have won many prizes. Some of her many recent articles include Where's My Professor? The Disappearing Faculty and the Lost Soul of American Higher Education, The Bad Old Days, How Higher Education Fared During the Great Depression, and Subversives, Squeaky Wheels and Special Obligation, Threats to Academic Freedom 1890 to 1960, which was published in 2009. Her most recent book is The Lost Soul of Higher Education, Corporatization, The Assault on Academic Freedom, and the End of the American University, published in 2010. In that book, she writes that the various assaults on the academy today may pose a greater threat to academic freedom than did McCarthyism in the 1950s. There is no one with more authority to make that statement, and no one from whom we can learn more about this topic than Ellen Schrecker. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Terry, and let's get this at the right level. Thank you, Peggy. It's really an honor to be back here in Ann Arbor, and a pleasure. My son graduated from Michigan, so I have a family connection, as it were. You know, I love the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA as it is called. As a historian of contemporary American politics, I've done a lot of research using documents that FOIA has released to me and other scholars. And I've even found some amazing information about the University of Michigan during the McCarthy period in the FBI files that Clement Markert was able to get through FOIA. So you can imagine my dismay as a card-carrying civil libertarian and life member of the AAUP when I learned about the recent efforts to use the FOIA to harass academics because of their scholarly work or political opinions. This is what happened to Bill Cronin, an eminent historian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who's done some path-breaking work in environmental history and who's about to become the president of the American Historical Association. Earlier this year, Cronin began a blog that he called Scholar as Citizen. Upset about Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's assault on public employee unions, he did a little research and he posted a report about an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council that provides assistance to conservative state legislators in drafting anti-labor and other similar measures. 2 days later, the state Republican Party used Wisconsin's Freedom of Information Act to request that the University of Wisconsin turn over all of Cronin's correspondence on his university email account that dealt with the public employee union controversy and the campaign to recall some of the Republican lawmakers involved. It's clear that the Republicans were hoping to find embarrassing evidence that Cronin had been using the university's resources for partisan political purposes, but he was a bright guy and he had been careful not to use the university email for any of his political activities. Moreover, the university authorities backed him up to a certain extent. They explained that they could find no untoward advocacy in Cronin's emails, nor would they release any materials that conflicted with student privacy laws or contained irrelevant personal or professional matters. In addition, the university's chancellor released a strong statement that expressed concern about the chilling effect of such a FOIA request on the scholarly interchange that is so crucial to the intellectual life of the university. Quote, "Having every exchange of ideas subject to political exposure," she said, "puts academic freedom in peril and threatens the processes by which knowledge is created." Soon after, as I assume most of you know, the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, a right-wing think tank in Michigan, made a similar demand for the emails of the labor study centers at MSU, Wayne State, and this institution. Again, the obvious intent was to find that the professors were politicking on the taxpayers' dime. The outcome of that request, as far as I can tell, remains unclear. This university in Wayne State released a handful of documents, while Michigan State's announcement that it would charge $5,600 for the materials seemed to have deterred the snoopers a bit. Meanwhile, the University of Virginia has been dealing with a two-pronged request for the records of a former faculty member named Michael Mann, whose climate studies made him a target of the folks who claim global warming is a hoax. First, the Virginia Attorney General subpoenaed Mann's email correspondence on the pretext that he was looking for evidence of fraud. When the university resisted that request, a libertarian think tank turned to the state's FOIA law and has apparently succeeded in getting the desired documents, even though it's not going to be able to publicize or disseminate them. The issues raised in all these cases are far from theoretical. FOIA-type requests seriously threaten academic research and have already induced several people to abandon work on controversial projects, and even in one case, to leave the academy altogether. As this recent spate of harassment by FOIA reveals, American higher education is under attack from forces on the political right. What makes this situation so serious, and it is, I believe, the most dangerous assault on academic freedom since this university fired Chandler Davis and Mark Nickerson and almost fired Clement Markert. What makes it so dangerous is that it's occurring at a moment when the entire academic community is under enormous pressure, financial, of course, but also ideological and structural. Last year, when I published my recent book, The Lost Soul of Higher Education, I have to admit that I thought the subtitles, which my editor just loved, I thought that subtitle was a little too extreme. Corporatization, the assault on academic freedom, and the end of the American university? Now I'm not so sure. And so in my talk this afternoon, I want to explore the reasons for my growing pessimism. But before I do, I want to emphasize that I'm speaking from the perspective of the faculty. All too often, the current debate over higher education has been hijacked by businessmen, politicians, and pundits, while the voice of the faculty has been muffled or marginalized. Yet, faculty members are arguably the most important, and I hate this word, but it works, stakeholders within the university. They are the men and women who have made a lifetime commitment to academia. They constitute the educational core of their institutions. They produce and transmit the knowledge, without which those institutions would simply not exist. And as I explore the fate of the academic profession and the institutions in which its members work, I will be discussing two separate but related phenomena. I will, of course, look at the current attacks on what I call traditional academic freedom, by which I mean those policies and practices that protect the faculty's freedom of expression in and outside of class, as well as its equally important, though I think less obvious, role in preserving the faculty's autonomy and ability to carry out its academic responsibilities. But I'm also going to examine some of the other challenges to the university that come in areas that we might not necessarily associate with academic freedom, but are actually more of a threat to it and to the quality of American higher education. Like the increasing casualization of the faculty, most of these challenges result from the corporate-style restructuring of the academy that has been taking place over the past 40 years. That restructuring is, I should note, part of a much broader neoliberal assault on the public sector that's actually occurring everywhere else throughout the world. My main contention here is that the structural developments of the past few decades have so weakened the power and autonomy of the nation's faculties that it has become difficult, if not impossible, for the academic profession to defend itself, not to mention the rest of higher education. Contributing to these problems has been a long-term political campaign against the university that 9/11 and the current crisis of capitalism have simply intensified. But before we look at that political campaign, I'd like to give a quick overview of what academic freedom is and how it functions, or at least how it should function. In its traditional form, as articulated nearly 100 years ago by the founders of the AAUP, academic freedom posits that as long as college and university teachers fulfill their academic responsibilities, their teaching, research, and extramural speech should be protected from external interference. In other words, they shouldn't lose their jobs or be otherwise sanctioned by their institutions because of outside political pressures. Because this protection deals with a faculty member's freedom of expression, many assume that it is covered by the First Amendment. And to a certain extent, it is or was, at least until a 2006 Supreme Court decision known as Garcetti versus Ceballos. In that case, the justices ruled 5-4 against a Los Angeles assistant district attorney who had been sanctioned for complaining about misconduct in the DA's office. According to that decision, although the First Amendment would protect a government employee who spoke out as a citizen, it would not cover that person's job-related speech. Think about it. For the academic community, most of whose members work in public colleges and universities, the case sets a frightening precedent. After all, just about everything a faculty member says or writes is related to his or her job. Garcetti's implications were so ominous, in fact, that Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, added a footnote explaining that the decision might not apply in an academic setting, while Justice Souter, in an impassioned dissent, specifically noted that the decision would, quote, imperil First Amendment protection of academic freedom in public colleges and universities whose teachers necessarily speak and write, quote, pursuant to official duties. Since then, the lower courts have split over the issue. Some pay attention to Kennedy's footnote and Souter's dissent and offer the First Amendment's protection to faculty members, while others ignore them and rule against professors whose schools have punished them for some kind of job-related speech or behavior. In one case, currently under appeal, a federal judge invoked Garcetti against a professor at Northeastern Illinois University who had been sanctioned for supporting a student protest against the CIA. Since that professor's activity was so clearly outside of her official duties, if the decision against her is upheld, it would essentially destroy all First Amendment protections for those who teach in public institutions. Now, Garcetti is not the only current legal challenge to academic freedom. Another one stems from the uncertainty about whether that freedom belongs to faculty members or to the colleges and universities that employ them. And over the past 10 years or so, the nation's judges have issued a number of rulings that favor institutional over individual academic freedom. Most notably, there's a 1999 case about a Virginia law that forbids state employees from accessing sexually explicit materials on their workplace computers. A group of professors challenged that law, and they claimed that it violated their academic freedom by restricting the kinds of research and teaching that they could do. In rejecting that claim, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is rather a conservative one, stated that academic freedom, and I quote, inheres in the university, not in individual professors. Fortunately, academic freedom relies on more than the Constitution. After all, the First Amendment only protects individuals from the government. Academics like myself, who work at private rather than public institutions, cannot rely on the Bill of Rights for any protection from our employers for our teaching, research, or extramural speech. Even so, I do have academic freedom, as do most full-time tenured and tenure-track faculty members, whether at public or private institutions. It is a professional privilege that is usually guaranteed by traditional practices and by inclusion in faculty handbooks that provide legal protection in the form of a contract. Our academic freedom, I think, exists in large part because it's essential to maintaining the quality of higher education. It enables members of the academic profession to carry out our core academic functions of teaching and research. Outside interference deforms those functions. If, for example, politicians or trustees force biologists to teach creationism or historians to propound the advantages of slavery, they're undermining the institutions they're supposed to support. Without academic freedom, the quality of higher education is seriously going to decline. Perhaps because of its focus on free expression, the contemporary debate over the university often ignores this function of academic freedom. Yet, as the experiences of the academic community under authoritarian regimes like Hitler's Germany or the Soviet Union reveal, stifled minds can only train or indoctrinate their students. They really can't educate them in any genuine way. And in order to do that, professors not only need to be free from extraneous interference with their teaching and research, they also need to control those aspects of their working conditions that make it possible for them to maintain their school's intellectual integrity and educational standards. Now, as it has evolved over the past century, academic freedom, in the broad sense of the term in which I'm using it, operates through three concrete mechanisms: tenure, faculty governance, and peer review. All, in one way or another, protect members of the academic profession from improper external interference and ensure that they have the most say over those aspects of the educational process for which they have primary responsibility. Tenure is the most well-known and controversial of these three. From the start, it has been crucial to the maintenance of academic freedom. While the overwhelming majority of faculty members are never going to venture into the kinds of controversies that require such protection, having it enables those who do need it to continue their activities without fear of losing their jobs. It also protects whole fields or subjects that are politically contested. Religious and gender studies, for example, and more recently, Middle East studies. Tenure does not provide 100% protection. Especially during moments of political tension, it cannot protect faculty members from powerful adversaries and spineless administrations. Still, at the height of the McCarthy era, when at least 100 tenured and non-tenured academics lost their jobs, with the one exception of Michigan's Clement Markert, every individual that I know of who survived the Inquisition had tenure. Misconceptions abound. Contrary to the most common one, tenure does not guarantee a lifetime sinecure. Tenured faculty members can be dismissed. Even the AAUP allows that, but only after hearings and appeals, and only for incompetence, moral turpitude, or because their programs are being terminated or the institution is in such dire financial straits that its very survival is at stake. That we know of such few dismissals does not mean that the Academy is teeming with tenured dead wood. Rather, I think it testifies to the ubiquity of litigation and the willingness of all sides to ease unsatisfactory academics quietly off the payroll. Tenure serves other functions as well, especially in the days when most faculty members could reasonably expect to get it. The security it offered attracted talented people to a profession that paid them less than similarly credentialed individuals could earn somewhere else. Theoretically, Tenure also operates to protect the quality of the faculty. The rigorous review that accompanies its award is designed to eliminate poor teachers and sloppy researchers. It doesn't always do that, but attempts to replace it with long-term contracts, for example, have proved no better. Schools that do use these long-term contracts usually tend to postpone unfavorable decisions and actually are granting de facto tenure to almost everybody. Of course, tenure will do little to preserve the integrity of higher education if it's not primarily determined by faculty members. So the other two mechanisms of academic freedom, faculty governance and peer review, are also crucial. They ensure that the decisions about what gets taught and who teaches it are made by the men and women who carry out those decisions, and that they make those decisions according to their best judgment of the pedagogical and intellectual issues involved. The academic community has developed a variety of institutions to handle these chores. We're talking about departmental committees, faculty senates, disciplinary organizations, scholarly journals, university presses, and the like. The expertise that these bodies possess ensures that decisions about academic matters accord with the Academy's own standards. Who but another medievalist is best qualified to assess the quality of a Chaucer scholar's work? Who can better determine the most effective sequence of mathematics courses than the members of the math department? Certainly not the real estate developers on the Board of Trustees. The autonomy of the academic profession can be abused, but the system has worked pretty well for a century, and it contributes to the high regard that American higher education has long enjoyed. But, as I am going to explain later, the structural changes of the past few decades have so undermined the power and autonomy of the academic profession that it has become increasingly difficult for the nation's college and university teachers to defend themselves within their own institutions, let alone ward off their external critics. Now, it's possible that the faculty's loss of clout would not be such a serious threat to academic freedom if American higher education were not also the target of a serious political attack. That attack originated within the corporate right about 40 years ago, and if I had had time, I would have read excerpts from that Lewis Powell memorandum that Peggy Hollingsworth talked about earlier. Since then, and especially since 9/11 and the recent financial crisis, this political assault has been intensified. Determined to roll back the remnants of the 1960s and create a more business-friendly political culture, Powell and a group of conservative business leaders and philanthropists organized what was a surprisingly self-conscious campaign against the so-called liberal academy that they at least believed had turned the public against the free enterprise system. This operation against the academic community employed two strategies. One was a public relations campaign designed to delegitimize mainstream academic knowledge by supporting the academy's critics. The other was the creation of an alternative source of expertise for policymakers, journalists, and politicians. The results of that campaign, from the establishment of the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing think tanks, to the contributions of such writers as Alan Bloom and Dinesh D'Souza to the so-called culture wars of the late 1980s and 90s, that campaign not only shifted American political discourse to the right, but also put all of higher education on the defensive. As a result, many ordinary Americans believe that the academic community is composed of overpaid deadbeats and tenured radicals. What makes this scenario so deleterious is that it has played into the economic insecurities of those Americans who view a college education as their only hope and their children's only hope for achieving or retaining middle-class status. So a legitimate concern about access and accountability has morphed into an attack on all the real and imaginary failings of higher education. As a result, it has become common to blame the faculty for just about every problem on campus, except perhaps for a losing football team. The problems, of course, are real enough. Tuitions are rising, the student debt burden is increasingly insupportable, classes are overcrowded or canceled, and worst of all, an academic degree no longer guarantees a secure, well-paying job. But it's not the faculty's fault. And in any event, restructuring higher education is not going to cure the nation's current woes. But rather than deal with the economic inequities produced by the wonders of contemporary capitalism, the powers that be are pressing for, quote unquote, reforms on the nation's campuses. And as far as I can tell, so far, all they've produced is a mania for assessment and an ever-growing focus on a narrow economic agenda for higher education. At the same time, the fallout from 9/11 has reduced the political space for dissent on campus as well as off. While we're not seeing the kinds of academic freedom violations that have characterized the worst of the McCarthy era, there have been a few notorious cases. You probably all know about Ward Churchill, and there have also been some politically motivated tenure denials and attempts to deny tenure, as well as speakers bans and, of course, the recent FOIA requests. Nonetheless, although the body count seems low, the current political assault on the university may well be more serious than that of the late 1940s and 50s. At that time, with the one exception of East Asian studies, some of whose most eminent practitioners were accused of having, quote unquote, lost China to the communists, the academic work of the McCarthy era victims did not come under scrutiny. The witch hunters were concerned about these people's past and present connections to the Communist Party. How Chandler Davis, for example, taught calculus to his students was simply beyond their purview. No longer. Now, many of the attacks on the academy deal specifically with the content of someone's teaching and research. In so doing, these attacks strike at the intellectual core of the faculty's work, something that even the most constricted formulation of academic freedom is understood to protect. Obviously, certain fields are more vulnerable than others. The Middle East has long been a minefield, as has labor studies. But as the troubles of Michael Mann in Virginia reveal, even climatologists are under attack. Climatologists? Who would have thought that studying tree rings would be so controversial? And given the volatility of contemporary American politics, it can be hard to predict what discipline is going to come under attack next. But all academics are at risk. You probably recall the abortive campaign several years ago by the right-wing activist David Horowitz, who was trying to induce state legislatures to pass his so-called academic Bill of Rights. Well, despite its name, that measure was a direct assault on the very essence of academic freedom. It was couched in the liberal-sounding language of balance and openness. But Horowitz's demand for quote-unquote intellectual diversity would not only have forced colleges and universities to hire conservatives, but it would also have subjected classrooms and syllabi to external political tests. that this proposed law rarely got out of committee was one of the Academy's few recent political victories, achieved in large part because of the joint efforts of administrators and faculty members in support of academic freedom. Such victories are few, however. All too often, when outsiders attack individual professors, administrators put up little resistance. This happened during the McCarthy era, and it is happening now. More commonly, however, the most serious damage to academic freedom has occurred without a public debate. It has taken place within the university, where the structural changes of the past few decades have undermined the power and autonomy of the faculty. All too often, however, most faculty members either didn't notice what was going on or else acquiesced in it. They simply, I think, didn't realize how drastically the changes that were occurring on their campuses were going to be affecting their own professional work and that of their colleagues. Most of those changes occurred in response to the financial crunch of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Until then, the Academy had been expanding rapidly, but as the post-war boom ended and policy circles embraced neoliberalism's worship of the market and disparagement of the public sector, that previously unquestioning political support for higher education began to decline. State funding as a percentage of most public institutions' budgets dropped precipitously. And there's a wonderful quote by a former president of this institution who says that originally the university was a state-supported university, then it was a state-assisted university, and now it is a state-located university. Now, private schools suffered as well, and many of them were so strapped for cash that they dipped into their endowments. So, in response to this financial crunch, academic administrators began to seek new sources of income. They licensed the logos of winning teams to sportswear manufacturers. They developed office parks on university property and sought to patent the results of their faculty members' research. They also encouraged those faculty members to seek corporate funding. That quest produced ambiguous results, since such entrepreneurial ventures could violate academic freedom. Because corporations, for some funny reason, tended to be more interested in profiting from the research they sponsored than in furthering scientific progress, they often restricted their grantees' ability to publish their work or share it with their colleagues. They were also known to pull the plug in midstream if the research they were funding did not prove remunerative enough or if it didn't reach the desired results. A more reliable source of revenue for the academic community, of course, was its students' tuitions. Beginning in the 1970s, the Nixon administration diverted its support for higher education from institutions to individuals. It was following the market. Grants and loans to students replaced most other forms of federal aid to colleges and universities. As a result, the Academy found itself in an increasingly heated competition for ever more warm tuition-bearing bodies. In the process, administrators came to view students as customers that had to be wooed rather than as minds that had to be expanded. Resources went into such amenities as elaborate fitness centers, state-of-the-art computer facilities, winning football teams, and gourmet dining halls, while institutions vied for star professors and undergraduates with high SAT scores who would raise the school's ranking in that all-important U.S. News and World Report survey. Similarly, in response to the demands of their financially pressed students and their parents, they began to offer ever more vocationally oriented programs while cutting back on such frills as their humanities departments. Moreover, as they became increasingly concerned about their bottom lines, academic administrators adopted a more corporate and competitive mindset, abandoning the old-fashioned pursuit of the common good in favor of a narrower focus on the well-being of their own institutions, if not their own careers. Not only did these administrators emulate the corporate world, they often came from it, bringing with them a different time frame and a hierarchical rather than democratic management style. Faculty governance, these people believed, was inefficient, a relic of the Pleistocene, even though those administrators who actually consulted with their faculties tended to find it useful. At the same time, in large part because of the proliferation of auxiliary services and activities on their campuses, the size of their administrations grew. Academia now employs more administrators and non-instructional staff members than teachers. That's right, more administrators than faculty members. Universities are also emulating the private sector by cutting costs. They outsource bookstores, food services, and as many other operations as they can, while spending ever larger percentages of their budgets on administration, technology, and student services and amenities. The nation's colleges and universities are skimping on things like library books and the routine maintenance of the physical plant. I noticed that there were some broken facilities down there in the ladies' room. The most deleterious cutbacks, however, affect the faculty, as part-time and temporary instructors replace the traditional tenure-track professoriate. Administrators rationalize this substitution by citing the need for quote-unquote flexibility. But so many of these men, and mostly women, teach the same courses year after year, that it is clear that financial rather than educational considerations are driving the practice. Most adjuncts, after all, get no benefits, and in some places, they can be paid as little as $1,500 a course. This is by far the most serious structural problem facing higher education. At the moment, more than 70% of the nation's faculty members hold contingent appointments. That's right, 70% or more. To begin with, and though these people may be every bit as competent as their full-time tenured and tenure-track colleagues, they cannot always offer a comparable education. To begin with, they're often hired at the last minute with little time to prepare their classes, sometimes even in fields they know little about. In addition, because many must commute to several institutions in order to pay the rent, they can rarely hold office hours. That is, if they even have offices, which many do not. They also lack the time and professional resources to keep up their scholarship. And, of course, since they can be fired or not rehired at will, with no notice, for any reason or for no reason at all, they have no academic freedom. None, that is, unless they are protected by a union contract, and we all know what's happening there. Terrible as this situation is for the lives and careers of the non-tenure track faculty members, it is equally deleterious for the quality of higher education. Because the hiring decisions for these teachers rely very heavily on student evaluations, they're tempted not to challenge their students with difficult or controversial material or to give them bad grades. It is significant that over the past few years, most of the serious violations of academic freedom that we know about have involved men and women with contingent appointments. Like, let me give you some examples. There's Maureen Watson, an off-the-ladder instructor at Nicholls State University in Louisiana, who was terminated abruptly for flunking the weak students in her math classes. There's Douglas Giles, acts for allowing a discussion of Israel, Zionism, and Palestine in his world religions class at Chicago's Roosevelt University, or Teresa Knudsen at Spokane Community College, who was fired for writing an op-ed in the local paper about the poor treatment of adjuncts. By casualizing the faculty, the academy is eating its seed corn. Eventually, even the most dedicated scholars and teachers will abandon the dream of an academic career. At that point, who knows what dystopic scenarios will unfurl? No doubt, a tiny percentage of traditional positions will remain at top-tier research universities and well-endowed private colleges. But most students attend less prestigious institutions where they're already struggling with overcrowded classes, rising tuitions, and a disappearing faculty. If recent trends persist, and the current economic crisis makes it almost certain that they will, American higher education as we know it may not endure. Technology is no solution, at least as it is currently employed. And what happened on one of the California State University colleges, campuses, provides a very grim warning here. Several years ago, the administration decided to replace the classroom-based freshman remedial mathematics course with a completely computerized online program. It dismissed the already non-tenure track faculty members who had been handling the 40-person sections and put the entire course of 400 undergraduates in the hands of a single non-tenure track instructor. The outcome could have been predicted. Whereas about 70% of the students regularly passed the traditional course, only 45% made it through the online version. The rest, mainly first-generation college students with working class and minority backgrounds, may have to drop out of school. That story shows how deleterious the hollowing out of the faculty can be. An equally serious problem is the growing emphasis on vocational training that has not only dumbed down the curriculum, but also undermined the university's civic mission. Outside of the elite colleges and universities, most students no longer receive the kind of education that exposes them to much beyond the marketplace, if they ever did. The growing class stratification of American society, in other words, has an intellectual component. Finally, as we look beyond the campus, we need to recognize that the decline of the academic community is not only eroding the democratic promise of mass higher education, but is also sapping the intellectual vitality of American culture. For many years now, the nation's campuses have served as the main haven for dissenting voices and complicated ideas. But as we have seen, that function is increasingly under attack. Moreover, as higher education becomes ever more corporatized, it is by no means the case that the academic community can contribute to the common good in any but the narrowest technocratic way. A democratic society requires citizens who can think for themselves as well as earn a living. But without a core of dedicated and independent professors, it is hard to see how America's colleges and universities can provide that educated citizenry. It is a scary thought indeed. Thank you.
I basically agree with virtually everything you said today, except at one point you said, it's not the faculty's fault. And my visceral reaction was, well, who the hell do you think its fault is? Look around this room. This room should be packed with every faculty member here at the university, okay, who feels the slightest about academic freedom. Where are they? Okay? They have to stand up. You can't sort of give them carte blanche and say, it's not your fault, poor babies. Okay? I mean, you've got to point the finger while identifying the problem. I'm sorry.
Yes. Look, I've been active in the AAUP for years, and the AAUP since the 1970s, since this sort of campaign against the universities began, has dwindled in size. It's now half or less of what it once was at its height. And you're quite right that the faculty certainly is part of the problem. But I don't think the sort of corporatization and it's the faculty's fault for not standing up against these things, but I don't think the faculty initiated most of them.
Thank you for coming. The struggle for democracy has intensified over the last 3 years since the onset of the Great Depression, recession. In Wisconsin and Ohio and New Jersey, Michigan too, the attack on public employees' collective bargaining rights and freedom of association has intensified. In Michigan, the state legislature, dominated by Republicans, has initiated right to teach, which is right to work for public employees in secondary and elementary education. That's a retribution because the MEA here, the Michigan Education Association, underwrote a recall effort of one of the Republican legislators. Also, the Republican House has House Bill 4052, which criminalizes union activity in the public workplace. In essence, it prohibits public employees and their unions from holding union meetings in publicly owned buildings. You can get fined, the union can get fined $10,000, and it prohibits public employees from talking to others about union organizing in the workplace. Employees can be fined $1,000 and suffer 1 year in jail. Fortunately, we're beginning a fight back, as we see in Occupy Wall Street. And in that regard, there's going to be an Occupy Detroit action tomorrow. There's not a lot of people here today, but if you can spread the word, it'd be great. It starts tomorrow at 4 o'clock at the Spirit of Detroit and goes down to Grand Circus Park. We expect over 1,200 participants. So my question is, can you speak broadly to the struggle, the mass struggle, not just in faculty, but in the body politic, so we can fight back?
Yes. There's nothing to disagree with you there.
You mentioned the faculty handbook as a possible source of protection of the faculty. The University of Michigan has argued recently in a court case that university policy creates no enforceable legal rights. And so a policy against the discrimination against a gay or lesbian faculty member cannot be enforced in court. So, the university, with its tremendous, deep pockets and, many lawyers, how does the faculty member fight those kind of arguments?
It's a good question. I know that some courts have upheld faculty handbooks as contracts. There is legal precedent there. And obviously, maybe you should consult the AAUP. They have some good lawyers, and this is the kind of thing that they are, willing to work on. It's very problematic. We are fighting a rearguard action, it feels like, on every front.
Thanks for your talk. I certainly agree with the points you made. At the same time, I can't help but wonder if the university maybe hasn't always been sort of that I can't remember your phrase, old-fashioned place for the old-fashioned pursuit of the common good. And I think that and if you look back at the 50s, and I mean there were the university involvement in the military-industrial complex, and I think that it's only been relatively recently in our history, well, first of all, that we had mass higher education, and I think that the university became a place for the sort of professionalization, if you will, of dissent, for better or worse. And so I think that there's maybe a more I don't know if you could maybe speak to sort of the I don't know, is there maybe a more complicated story here about sort of the sort of emergence of that role for the university in American life, and kind of what's happened to that since the 60s?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that there was never a quote-unquote golden age of higher education. However, what we're seeing with the current corporatization is a marketization and a privatization of so many of the university's educational and intellectual functions. I mean, I do see a sort of qualitative shift here in that sense, especially the vocationalization of higher education, the increasing numbers of programs that are the emphasis on education as leading only to jobs, I think seriously narrows it. Was it ever not connected to the powers that be? Of course not. It's always been part of the establishment. But there has been a little wiggle room, and I think that the structural undermining of the faculty is really, in the process, destroying that wiggle room. There's very little left.
First of all, thank you for coming. And my only sticking point on the whole thing is with assessment becoming such a huge thing at the undergraduate level for post-undergraduate schools, law school, med school, that I feel gives the faculty, particularly in the eyes of their students, a much higher role in terms of influences and thought processes. And I don't want to say censorship, because I don't think that's quite the right word, but shouldn't there be some form of accountability or something in terms of you give one professor who has all these kids who are looking for them for their approval in terms of ideas and the knowledge you're supposed to gain in a class, which is somewhat up to the professor to decide. And at what point do we worry that that it can go too far, and then you have like professors using their power to influence what all these 17, 18, 19-year-old college students are thinking?
Well, I think a lot of this, to a certain extent, requires the faculty to police itself and to, in many cases, there is a reluctance on the part of the faculty to kind of ride herd on itself and its colleagues and make sure that they're not overstepping the lines. But I don't think you're seeing what you seem to see as a kind of indoctrination on the part of the professor. Professors are out there usually trying to present the material that they want covered in the a way that they think is most effective. And, they should be allowed to do it in whatever way they want, as long as they're being intellectually responsible. If they're ignoring the kind of standards of their discipline, and, for example, a music professor going on and on and on about the crisis of modern capitalism in his class, that is not acceptable. So, a lot of this is self-policing, but I think it usually works. There haven't been cases of, or many cases of professors indoctrinating their students. Students are much too smart for that. If I could indoctrinate my students, that would be great, but it's not going to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Can you speak to the University of Michigan itself when it comes to the quality of education that it provides and the way that it protects academic freedom for its instructors?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Can you speak to the University of Michigan itself when it comes to the quality of education that it provides and the the way that it protects the academic freedom for its instructors?
You mean today?
Yes.
Probably not as well as the people here. I'm not really on top of things that are happening now. I know that when my son graduated 20 years ago, it was a terrific education. I really don't know. I don't know, for example, what the percentage of people with contingent appointments are on this faculty. I don't know how big a problem that is. I just don't know. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
This will obviously be a question from a non-lawyer. My understanding of the Constitution is that rights adhere to the individual. There is practically no mention of rights to groups except through free association of individuals. How is it, going back to that 2006 decision, which I think has been followed up by, for example, Citizens United, how is it that there has been a transformation of rights from the individual recognized under the Constitution to groups which have no standing under the Constitution?
Good question. We know it's coming from these rather conservative gentlemen on the Supreme Court. I was down at the Occupy Wall Street demonstration down in New York City. And my favorite sign, there are lots and lots of signs all over, people have done them up in cardboard. They're very amateur looking, they're wonderful. And my favorite was, we will know that corporations are individuals when the state of Texas executes one. What can I say?
So thank you for your talk. And I have two questions, each addressed to a sort of different side of what was great about your talk. The first would be addressed to this very broad sort of overview of these issues. And it would be, in some ways continuing the previous question, it would be the question of corporatization and the corporation. The corporation is a very, very big historical phenomenon. And I wonder if it may be, in thinking about these issues, a little bit too broad of a brush to think about the corporation in the way that we're talking about it, whether there are differences to be made among corporations, to periodize the corporate influence. So it's a very broad question. And the second question, I'll just ask it, is directed more towards the inspiring aspect of your talk, of inspiring us to act. And it would be from your point of view, as someone who really gets an overview of these questions, where do you see the effective work? Where can we put our efforts? Because I think, for example, of the Modern Languages Association's really good and important work on contingent faculty. I think of the possibility of, a union organizing drive here on campus, the AAUP. Where do you see the sites that might be turning points and effective places to put our energy?
What's interesting is it seems to be in individual battles more, that we haven't created a faculty movement. There is no faculty movement. The AAUP shrinks. It costs over $100 to join, and people don't necessarily have that much disposable income, and they don't see themselves as part of that entity, the faculty that can mobilize as to go back to your first question, corporate body, in a sense. But, what happens is that at those moments, like when the David Horowitz attempts to pass these academic bills of rights were going through, there was a mobilization. It was politicized. I'm not sure how you can get the faculty's voice out there into the public. That's what I really worry about. Because you know what? It takes money. It takes money. And we don't have the kind of bankrolling that, say, the Tea Party people have. So, unless people are willing to go out and really put themselves on the line and devote time to that, and it's very hard. I mean, for a junior faculty person who's facing a tenure decision and now has to have one book and a book contract and who knows what else, they don't have time, So I wish I could give you an answer. I mean, join the AAUP, organize a union. I'm sort of very concerned, and I don't know.
I'll remind you of the first question about the corporate.
About corporatization. No, I think you're right, that it is, especially on the left, one of these much overused terms. But what I think in the way that I'm using it in the book, it's sort of the penetration of business values and sort of profit-making, decision-making into, and it's growing in corporatization into the university structure and into the way the university does business. That it's beginning to think not like we sort of think of universities as, or one would like to think of them, as institutions that are devoted to some higher function than just kind of doing well for itself. But what's been happening, certainly within most academic administrations, is a concern with growing the institution, with competing, with all of these values that don't really belong here. And I think, if nothing else, we have to fight to bring back the sense of education as something beyond the marketplace. And, I think there's a recent book out by, I'm having a senior moment. Anyhow, forgot her name. Called, I think, Beyond the Marketplace, which talks about the value of the humanities and sort of talks about what it is that education in its kind of non-market functions can do for people and can do for a society. And we're losing that, and we have to actually articulate it and fight for it. I hope that answers it.